Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. It was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon. Mark and I had dreamed of this moment for months. Our escape into the mountains, far away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Just the two of us, a remote hotel tucked away in nature's embrace, and a chance to relax after the whirlwind of our wedding. The drive seemed endless, winding through thick forests and up steep, narrow roads. As we neared our destination, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a bruised sky painted in shades of purple and orange. The air outside was crisp and refreshing, but something about the landscape felt different, almost too quiet. And then we saw it. The hotel stood at the end of the road like something from another time. Towering, dark, and made of stone, it looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries, waiting patiently for someone to stumble upon it. The ivy that crept up its walls seemed to almost claim the building, a constant reminder that nature was slowly taking back what man had built. My heart skipped a beat, but Mark just drove on, his grip tight on the wheel. "This place is something else," he muttered under his breath, clearly skeptical about everything around us. But I was already mesmerized. There was something captivating about it, something that pulled me in. I couldn't wait to see the inside. We pulled up to the entrance, and I got out of the car, the chill of the wind biting at my skin. The hotel looked even more imposing up close, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The door was made of thick, heavy wood, and when Mark pushed it open, the sound of the bell ringing echoed through the lobby, loud, sharp, and oddly ominous. Inside, the air was thick with dust and age. The chandeliers above flickered dimly, casting long, haunting shadows across the room. Antique furniture was scattered about, chairs with velvet cushions that looked like they hadn't been sat in for years, a grand mirror that felt too reflective, and paintings on the walls, all depicting people whose eyes seemed to follow you, watching your every move. At the desk sat an elderly woman, her face pale and sharp. Her gray eyes never left the papers in front of her as she slowly shuffled them. She didn't even greet us when we approached, her movements deliberate and slow, as if she were caught in some trance of her own. When she finally looked up, her eyes met mine, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Welcome to the Blackstone Hotel," she said, her voice low and monotone, as if the words were foreign to her. "Your room is ready." I smiled, trying to ignore the unease settling in my chest. "Thank you," I said, my voice a little too loud, a little too eager. But Mark, always the logical one, didn't seem convinced. He didn't say anything, but I could see it in his eyes. He was already regretting this. Still, we didn't turn back. The receptionist handed us a key. No smile, no warmth, just the brass key with 319 engraved on it. As she handed it over, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll find it comfortable," she said, "but don't try to leave once you're inside." I froze. It didn't make sense. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice faltering despite myself. But she was already turning back to her papers, her focus entirely elsewhere. There was no explanation, no more words, just the key, cold in my hand, and the strange, foreboding feeling that something was very wrong. Mark gave me an uncertain look, but we said nothing more. I felt him tense beside me as we made our way up the staircase. The hallway stretched before us, a long, narrow passage lined with closed doors. The air felt too still, too quiet, and the silence pressed down on me, suffocating and heavy. The only sound was the soft thud of our footsteps on the old carpet beneath our feet. Room 319. The door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The room was exactly as I'd imagined. A grand four-poster bed draped in rich, dark velvet curtains, an old mirror reflecting the dim light of the room, and windows that overlooked the mountain landscape. It was everything I could have wanted, if only it didn't feel so wrong. I shrugged off the unease. "It's perfect," I told Mark, forcing a smile. "Don't you think?" But Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood in the middle of the room, looking around with a furrowed brow, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "It's nice, but something about this place doesn't sit right with me." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "You're just being paranoid. It's fine. Let's just relax." We unpacked our bags, and I tossed myself onto the bed, stretching out. The cool mountain air coming through the window was refreshing. The night seemed peaceful, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange warning from the receptionist. I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the room wash over me. But as I drifted to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching, lurking just beyond the edges of the room, hidden in the shadows. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Mark's voice. "Lisa, wake up. This isn't our room." I blinked, disoriented. What was he talking about? I rubbed my eyes and looked around. The bed was the same, the window was the same, but everything else was off. The wallpaper had changed. The furniture, it was rearranged. This wasn't the same room. How did we... I started to ask, but my voice trailed off as I reached for the door. I opened it and saw the same hallway, the same closed doors lined up before us. But there was no denying it. We were no longer in room 319. This wasn't just some odd coincidence. We had moved, in the middle of the night, without leaving the bed. We hadn't gone far before we heard it again. The old man, the one we had seen in the lobby the night before, appeared in the doorway. "You're in the wrong room," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes dark and knowing. "You're not the first." Before we could respond, he turned and walked away, his shuffle fading into the silence of the hall. And that's when I realized, this place, this hotel, wasn't just strange. It was alive. And it had a plan for us. The hotel was never what it seemed, and no matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried to escape, we kept waking up in a new room each morning. And it was only getting worse. I wish we had left when we had the chance. But now, I don't think we ever will. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Mark and I had been looking forward to this honeymoon for months, just the two of us, away from the chaos of the world. We had picked a secluded mountain hotel, far from the hustle and bustle, thinking we would find some peace there. But that was before we arrived. The drive up was long, the road winding through thick forests and up steep hills. The higher we climbed, the quieter it got, until the world seemed to vanish altogether, leaving only the soft hum of the car's engine. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the sky turned a deep purple, casting an eerie glow over everything. I could feel my excitement building, but there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite place, that made my skin prickle. And then we saw it. The hotel stood at the end of the road, massive and imposing, made of dark stone, as though it had risen from the very ground itself. Ivy twisted around its walls, the windows were black and lifeless, and the front door, heavy, wooden, and foreboding, seemed to beckon us inside. For a moment, I thought I could hear something, some kind of whisper in the wind, but I dismissed it as just my imagination. Mark wasn't so sure. "This place is something else," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. I smiled, trying to convince myself everything was fine. I'd been wanting something a little more, different than the usual beach resort. "It's perfect," I said, though my voice didn't sound quite as sure as I felt. I thought I saw Mark glance at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, but I brushed it off. He always overthinks things. When we parked, a cold breeze hit me as I stepped out of the car. The air smelled strange, earthy, like damp stone and pine. Mark grabbed our bags from the back, but his steps were slower now, his posture stiffer. "Come on, let's go check in," I said, trying to shake off my own creeping unease. I wanted to believe this was just me being silly. The lobby was dark and still, the silence almost suffocating. The only sound was the soft ringing of a bell as we entered. The receptionist didn't look up from her papers as we approached. Her face was pale, her eyes gray and sunken, as though she hadn't seen daylight in years. She handed us a brass key without saying a word. The key had the number 319 etched into it, and when I reached for it, her fingers brushed mine, cold, like ice. "Welcome to the Blackstone Hotel," she said, her voice low, almost mechanical. "Your room is ready." "Thank you," I said, trying to muster some cheer. But as I turned to leave, she added, her voice barely a whisper, "You'll find it comfortable, but don't try to leave once you're inside." Her words felt like a cold draft. I glanced back at her, but she had already returned to her papers, completely indifferent. I didn't know whether to laugh or be alarmed. I just shrugged it off. Silly, I thought. Just an odd receptionist. We made our way upstairs. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The hotel felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in as we walked down the hallway, the air colder with each step. There were no windows, just doors, endless rows of them, all identical, leading nowhere I could make sense of. The silence pressed against my chest, and I found myself hurrying my steps to catch up with Mark. Room 319 was at the end of the hallway. The door creaked as Mark opened it. Inside, it looked perfect. Too perfect. The bed was large and luxurious, draped with dark velvet curtains that looked like they belonged in another era. The air smelled faintly of flowers, too sweet, almost suffocating. The room was beautiful, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Mark didn't seem to notice. He was already unpacking, setting his things down on the dresser. But he didn't look quite right. His shoulders were tense, his movements stiff. "It's nice," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "A little quiet." I forced a smile. "It's just the mountain air. Don't overthink it, okay?" But I could feel it too. The silence in the room was thick, pressing against me like a heavy weight. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the expectation. It was like the room itself was waiting for something. I pulled the covers up, trying to push the feeling away. Mark joined me on the bed after a while, his body rigid as he lay down next to me. We tried to talk, tried to relax, but the words felt hollow in the stillness. It was like the walls were watching us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling wouldn't go away. "Maybe you're right," Mark said after a while, his voice low. "Maybe it's just the isolation. It's messing with my head." "Yeah, that's it," I agreed, though my voice trembled slightly. The shadows seemed to shift around us, as though they were stretching toward us, hungry and dark. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. But the more I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, the stronger the feeling grew. Something wasn't right here. I drifted off to sleep eventually, the quiet overwhelming me, my mind clouded with unease. I woke with a start. The room was dark, darker than it should have been. The window was wide open now, but the room was colder. Much colder. My breath puffed out in little clouds of mist, and when I turned to look at Mark, he wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat. "Mark?" I whispered, sitting up. "Mark, where are you?" The bed creaked behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see him. Maybe he'd just gotten up to use the bathroom or something. But there was nothing. Only the heavy, suffocating silence. Suddenly, there was a soft creak from the closet. I froze. The door, which had been shut tightly when we first arrived, was now slightly ajar. The shadows behind it were thick, unnaturally dark, like they were alive, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air felt too thick, as if something was pressing against my chest, making it harder and harder to get air. I needed to get up. I needed to... A soft whisper. It came from the closet, from the shadows. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a sound I would never forget, low, guttural, like a voice that didn't belong to this world. I jumped out of bed, my feet barely touching the cold floor. I reached for Mark again, but there was no answer. The room was empty, alone. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, closer. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run. But where could I go? The hallway? The hotel itself felt like a maze, its walls shifting, the doors never leading anywhere I could make sense of. I heard a footstep, then another. I spun around, but it wasn't Mark who stood behind me. The elderly man, the one from the lobby. His eyes were wide, dark, as if he had seen things no human should. His voice was barely a whisper. "You've woken up in the wrong room," he rasped. Before I could speak, before I could even react, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows, and I was left standing there, in the darkness, alone, with nothing but the suffocating presence of the hotel pressing in on me. I tried to wake Mark again. "Mark, wake up, something's wrong, something's happening." But he didn't move. And then, the whispers grew louder, and the door to room 319 slowly creaked open again. We were trapped. I wish I could say I didn't see it coming, the slow realization that something was horribly wrong with this place. But there was no ignoring it. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, like the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. For us. After a restless night, Mark and I tried to push the unease aside, telling ourselves it was just exhaustion, that everything would feel normal once the fog of sleep wore off. But the moment I opened my eyes that morning, it was impossible to ignore. The hotel felt wrong. The silence was too deep, too still. The way the air seemed to hang in the room, heavy and dense, pressing in on us. It was suffocating. We decided to get breakfast, hoping to break the tension, to shake off whatever had been lurking in the dark corners of the hotel the night before. But when we stepped into the hallway, the silence was overwhelming. There was no sound, no footsteps, no distant chatter, nothing. Even the echoes of our own steps seemed muffled. The hallway stretched out before us, the doors lined up on either side like forgotten sentinels, each one closed, each one hiding secrets we weren't ready to uncover. The lobby was no better. It was empty, as if everyone else had simply vanished. The air was thick, stale, and cold. As we walked through, I could feel my skin crawl. Mark glanced around nervously, clearly feeling the same. And that's when I saw him, the elderly man. He sat in one of the armchairs by the fireplace, his hands folded on his cane, his frail body leaning into the shadows. He was so still, so silent, that for a moment I thought he might be part of the furniture, some ancient relic of the hotel itself. His face was like a map of time, every wrinkle etched deep, his skin so pale that it seemed almost translucent. His eyes were dark and hollow, and they locked onto mine the moment I entered the room. There was something wrong about him, something that made my stomach tighten, but at the same time, something that pulled me toward him. Mark was already moving toward the breakfast table, trying to pretend he hadn't noticed the man, but I couldn't stop staring. The old man's eyes never left me. And then his voice came, gravelly and slow. "You've come," he said, and his words sent a chill crawling up my spine. "You've come to the wrong place." I froze. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. Mark didn't hear it, didn't feel it, but I knew this man knew something. I don't know how I knew it, but I felt it deep in my gut, as if the weight of his words was pulling me closer to the inevitable. He motioned toward the chair in front of him with a slow, trembling hand, and without thinking, I sat. Mark followed reluctantly, though I could see the wariness in his eyes. We both watched the man, unsure of what was about to happen, but I had the feeling that we weren't in control anymore. The old man didn't speak right away. He simply studied us, his gaze unwavering. His lips parted slightly, and I could feel the air around us grow colder. It was as if the very room was holding its breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, like he was savoring each word. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This hotel isn't what it seems. It's never what it seems. It doesn't just take guests, it keeps them." I blinked, trying to make sense of the words, but I couldn't. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes seemed to look through me, past me, as though he could see something I couldn't. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward, his hands tightening around his cane, and his voice dropped to an almost inaudible rasp. "The rooms," he whispered. "They're not just rooms, they're doors, and each door leads somewhere else, somewhere you don't want to go." I felt the blood drain from my face, my body frozen in place. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. But I could hear the conviction in his voice, the certainty that sent a shiver up my spine. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking to the door, as though he was ready to get up and leave. "This is crazy," he muttered, trying to laugh it off. "We're just here for a weekend getaway, that's all." But the old man didn't let him off so easily. His voice became sharper, cutting through the air. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This hotel doesn't just trap you in the walls, it takes your soul. It keeps you, forever." I felt my throat close up. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by the weight of his words. Mark looked at me, and I could see the same fear reflected in his eyes. "If it's so bad, why are you still here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. I couldn't stop myself from speaking, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The old man's lips twitched into something that resembled a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was bitter, hollow. His eyes grew darker, and he leaned in closer, his voice low and urgent. "I can't leave," he said. "None of us can. We're all trapped here." My heart pounded in my chest. I was shaking now, the full weight of his words crushing down on me. My breath quickened, and I turned to Mark, desperate for reassurance, but his face was pale, his mouth pressed into a tight line. He was no longer laughing. What are you saying?" Mark whispered. "What do you mean, trapped? Why haven't you just left?" The old man's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. "You don't get it," he said quietly. The hotel chooses its guests, and once you're here, you're never truly gone. You may leave the building, but you'll never leave the hotel. It's always with you, watching you. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to get up, to run, but the room seemed to close in around me. The air felt too thick, too heavy. The old man's eyes bore into mine. "You've been marked," he said softly. "Just like the rest of us. There's no way out." Suddenly, Mark stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, breaking the tension that had settled in the room. "This is insane. We're leaving. Now." I stood too, my legs weak beneath me. I wanted to follow Mark, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but the old man stopped me with one final look, one that cut through me like a blade. "You can try to leave," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "But know this, you won't leave alone." My heart slammed in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The words wrapped themselves around me, choking me, until I could barely breathe. The old man sat back in his chair, his eyes glimmering with something darker now, and without another word, he turned away from us. We both stood there, staring at the empty chair where he had been just moments before, unable to comprehend what had just happened. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. We were left standing there in the silence of the hotel, and that's when it hit me. I didn't just feel trapped. I was trapped. And so was Mark. This place wasn't just a hotel, it was a prison. And we had just signed our sentence. It was the second night that really started to break me. The night when I finally started to question everything, my sanity, my reality, and most of all, whether I'd ever leave this place. Mark and I had tried to pretend the night before was nothing but a bad dream, a weird fluke. We kept telling ourselves that the strange noises, the movement in the hallway, the oppressive silence in the room, it was all just in our heads. But deep down, I knew. I felt it. Something was very, very wrong. The evening had started innocently enough. Dinner in the dining room, which was just as eerily empty as it had been the night before. The silence, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery and our voices, felt almost suffocating. Mark was unusually quiet. I couldn't blame him. We were both on edge, but we tried our best to fill the air with casual conversation, to pretend everything was normal. But each laugh felt hollow, like a mask we were both wearing to distract ourselves from the growing dread pressing in around us. We made our way back to room 319, the same room we had stayed in the night before, though it felt different now. The walls, the very air seemed thicker somehow, heavier. The hotel itself felt alive, breathing in time with the pounding of my own heart. My skin crawled as we crossed the threshold. I could already sense the change, the shift in the atmosphere. The room was too quiet, too still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Mark was pacing. I could hear the soft thud of his footsteps on the wooden floor. His shoulders were tense, his back stiff. "This place is messing with my head," he muttered under his breath. I wanted to agree, but I couldn't find the words. How could I explain that it wasn't just the isolation, that it wasn't just exhaustion from the drive or the unsettling quiet? "I'm going to try and sleep," I said, though I didn't think I'd be able to. The bed was large, luxurious, and inviting, but tonight it felt like a trap, a place where the walls could close in on me if I wasn't careful. I crawled under the blankets, pulling them tightly around myself, but the tension in the room was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified in the silence, every rustle of fabric louder than it should have been. Mark joined me after a few moments, but sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, the bed creaking under his restlessness. I watched him for a while, his face tight with worry. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I already knew. He felt it too. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The air grew colder, colder than it had been since we arrived, and it seemed to press down on me. The stillness, the silence, it was suffocating. The room felt too close, too small, as though it was shrinking around us. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push the rising panic back down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it. A faint creaking sound, barely perceptible at first. But then it grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway just outside our door. Someone was walking. But the footsteps weren't normal. They were slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet along the floor. I held my breath, listening intently, heart hammering in my chest. The creaking continued, steady and relentless. It was almost like a rhythm, as though someone was pacing back and forth just beyond the door, their presence lingering, waiting. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mark, but my voice felt small in the oppressive silence. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the door, his face drawn tight with anxiety. I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my chest. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I hear it." We both lay there, frozen, staring at the door as the sound grew louder, closer. The creaking didn't stop. It wasn't a person walking, I realized. It was something else. Something else was out there, just beyond the door, moving in a way that didn't make sense. And then, without warning, the creaking stopped. The silence was deafening. It was as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. I held my breath, listening for any sound, any movement. My pulse was racing in my ears. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, the door moved. I could feel it before I even saw it. The slight shift in the air, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. I turned my head just in time to see the door move, slowly, imperceptibly. It wasn't much, just a crack. But it was enough to make my stomach drop, to send a chill racing down my spine. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place, as if I were caught in a dream, too terrified to move. The door creaked open just a sliver, barely wide enough to see into the dark hallway. The shadows out there were thicker now, stretching long into the hallway like black fingers reaching for the light. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the crack in the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, it happened. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving with unnatural speed, its body hunched, twisted at impossible angles. I couldn't make out its features, its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it, watching me. The figure stood there, just out of sight, its presence filling the hallway. It was like a living thing, waiting for us to notice it. I could feel its gaze on me, though I couldn't see its eyes. And in that moment, I knew that it wasn't human. It was something else, something far older and far darker. I gasped, a sharp breath escaping my chest, and in that instant the figure was gone, vanished back into the shadows from where it came. It was as if it had never been there at all. The door slammed shut. The suddenness of it made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. I turned to Mark, my voice trembling. "Did you see it?" I asked, but I could barely form the words. Mark looked at me, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing as if he was struggling to find the right words. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. Something was out there. Something was watching us. I nodded, my skin crawling. I didn't know if it had been real or if we had both just imagined it, but deep down, I knew it had been real. Whatever that thing was, it was in the hotel with us, and it wasn't leaving. We lay back down, but the fear didn't leave. It clung to me, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my chest like a vice. The room felt even smaller now, the walls closing in on us. And the silence was worse than the footsteps, the creaking, or even the figure itself. It was the waiting, the expectation, as though the hotel itself was listening to our every breath, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. Sleep didn't come. Not that night. I could feel the eyes of the hotel on me, and I knew, deep in my gut, that we were no longer just guests here. We were prisoners. And the hotel, it wasn't letting us go. Not now. Not ever. It was that second night when I realized just how much deeper we were sinking into this nightmare. Up until then, I had tried to convince myself it was just the isolation, the exhaustion, maybe even some bad luck. But I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong, not just with the hotel, but with everything around us. It wasn't just the cold, the silence, or the creeping dread I felt in my bones. It was something else. Something alive. Mark and I were both trying to stay calm, trying to convince ourselves that this was just another night, that we'd wake up in the morning and laugh about how we let our nerves get the best of us. But even as we spoke, there was an undeniable weight in the room, a heaviness that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. It was as if the hotel was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for us. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, the darkness in the corners growing thicker, like it was spreading. The walls felt too close, too suffocating, and the air was thick with something I couldn't describe. I glanced at Mark, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide with that same fear I was feeling. It was all-consuming, gnawing at us both, sinking into our skin like a poison. "I can't sleep," Mark muttered, his voice tight. He was pacing now, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the dead silence. "This place is messing with my head." I nodded, too afraid to speak. The room was too quiet, too still, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world outside had disappeared. The wind had died down hours ago, and now there was nothing but that suffocating silence, hanging over us like a thick fog. "I'm going to try," I whispered, lying back on the bed, though I knew sleep wouldn't come. The bed felt cold now, like it was part of the hotel, part of the emptiness that surrounded us. I pulled the covers over me, but they offered no comfort, only a sense of being trapped. I closed my eyes, but the darkness was different tonight. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. I could feel it pressing against me, seeping into my skin. Mark's movement stopped suddenly. I heard him suck in a breath, sharp and quick, as though he had just noticed something too. The silence between us grew thicker, heavier, and I didn't need to look at him to know that we were both thinking the same thing. The feeling wasn't just in our heads, the hotel was alive. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "do you feel that?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his face pale, his lips parted in a soundless breath. I followed his gaze. The door was just slightly ajar. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before, but now that I did, it was all I could see. The darkness on the other side was thick, impenetrable. And then I heard it. A creak. It was faint at first, so soft that I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, as if someone was walking outside our room. But no one was there. The hotel was empty. We were the only ones here. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly turned to look at Mark, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was frozen, his eyes wide with fear, his body stiff. "Mark?" I whispered, but he didn't answer. He was staring, unblinking, at the door. His lips trembled slightly, but he couldn't speak. The creaking continued. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing outside our room, the footsteps heavy and dragging. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was listen. The sound was getting closer, closer to the door. Suddenly, the door shifted. I could feel my heart stop. The door moved ever so slightly, not by itself, but as if someone, or something, was pushing it from the other side. My eyes were locked on it, too afraid to blink. The creak of the hinges was deafening in the stillness of the room, and my body went cold, paralyzed. Something was out there. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence. It was real. And then it happened. The door opened, slowly, agonizingly slow, just wide enough for a figure to appear in the crack. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape moving in the darkness. But then, I saw it more clearly. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was wrong, distorted. The shadows around it seemed to bend and twist, as if the darkness itself was alive, stretching and reaching out from the corners of the room. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in sharp, quick gasps. It didn't have a face, not one I could see. There was nothing there but a black void where its face should have been. And yet, I felt its eyes. I felt it looking at me, looking straight through me. My skin crawled, the hairs on my neck standing on end. It wasn't human. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't anything that belonged in this world. Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "Lisa, please, we need to go, now." But before we could move, the figure took a step forward. The darkness around it seemed to reach out, as if trying to pull us in. It was no longer just standing there, it was coming toward us, its movements unnaturally slow, like it was savoring each step, each moment. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The air in the room was thickening, suffocating us, and the whispers from the walls grew louder, almost drowning out the sound of my heartbeat. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Vanished. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, shaking the walls, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence in its wake. I don't know how long we sat there, too terrified to move, our minds racing, hearts pounding in our chests. Mark finally spoke, his voice trembling. Did you see that? It wasn't, nothing here is real. This isn't right." I couldn't speak, I couldn't form words. My mind was too full of that thing, that presence in the room, in the hotel, watching us, feeding on our fear. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but my body refused to obey. And then I realized this wasn't just some hotel. It wasn't just a building, it was alive. It had been alive long before we stepped inside, and it would be alive long after we were gone. The hotel knew us. It had marked us. And there was no way out. We were trapped here, forever. The darkness wasn't just outside our room. It was inside, too. It had been inside us all along. And that's when I understood. The hotel wasn't just keeping us here, it was feeding on us. Feeding on our fear. And we were just the latest guests in a long line of victims. We weren't just guests anymore, we were prisoners. And there was no escaping the hotel. That second night, everything changed. Mark and I had tried to pretend we weren't feeling it. The fear, the overwhelming something pressing in on us from all sides. The suffocating silence, the whispers, the cold that wrapped around us like an invisible shroud, chilling us to our core. But no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves it was just isolation or exhaustion, I knew. Deep down, I knew that the hotel wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something ancient, something that had been here long before we arrived and would remain long after we were gone. It started innocently enough. We returned to our room, trying to find comfort in the familiar. The same four-poster bed, the same dimly lit corners, the same oppressive silence. But there was a tension in the air, thick and unyielding. The walls felt closer tonight, like they were inching toward us. I glanced at Mark, who was pacing, his movements restless and jerky. "This place, it's messing with my head," he muttered, rubbing his forehead like he was trying to shake off some lingering thought, some gnawing feeling. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I felt it too, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Not to him, not to myself. The truth was, I didn't know what was happening. I just knew it was getting worse. The shadows seemed deeper now, more alive. The air was heavier. It felt like the hotel itself was breathing, like it was watching us. "I'm going to try to sleep," I said, even though I didn't think I could. My body ached with fatigue, but I couldn't shake the dread. I crawled into the bed, pulling the covers tight around my body, but sleep wouldn't come. It couldn't. The room was too alive, too heavy. I felt the eyes of the hotel on me, following my every move. Mark joined me eventually, but there was no comfort in the bed. I could feel his tension, his unease, radiating in the stillness. He lay there for what seemed like hours, just staring at the ceiling. Neither of us spoke. The silence was unbearable, thick with the weight of the unseen. It felt like the very walls were holding their breath. I must have drifted off at some point, but it wasn't sleep. It wasn't rest. It was more like being trapped in a haze, caught between wakefulness and some dark, twisted dream. And then I heard it. The faintest creak. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate creak from the hallway, just outside our room. I froze. Mark stirred beside me, his body tense. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes were wide, searching the shadows in the corners of the room. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The creaking continued. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside our door, dragging their feet across the floor. But no one was there. We were the only ones in this place. I thought we were. My pulse quickened as the creaking grew louder, closer. It felt like something was coming for us, moving in the dark just beyond the door, drawing nearer with each passing second. And then, the door began to move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door, which had been shut tight only moments before, was now opening inch by inch. It wasn't just shifting slightly. It was opening as if something or someone was on the other side, pushing it with deliberate slowness. My heart was pounding in my chest, every beat echoing in the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my gaze away from the crack that was growing wider with every agonizing second. "Mark?" My voice was barely a whisper, trembling with terror. "The door, it's moving." Mark didn't respond at first. He was staring at the door, frozen, his face pale with fear. And then, just as I thought I might go mad from the tension, I saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway. It was tall, too tall, its form distorted, like it didn't belong in this world. At first, it was just a shadow, a black silhouette against the darkness of the hallway, but as it stepped forward, I saw more of it. And I wished I hadn't. It wasn't human. Its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, too thin. It moved like it was gliding, its body jerking unnaturally with each step. But what was worse was the feeling, the sense that it was staring at me, even though I couldn't see its face. That's when I realized It didn't have a face. There was nothing there but a black void, a darkness that stared back at me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my throat closed up. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen, my body trapped in place. I couldn't look away. I had to look away, but I couldn't. "Lisa!" Mark's voice was barely audible, strangled by the fear in his throat. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was screaming at me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. Nothing about this made sense. The air was thick with dread, like the very room was suffocating us. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, watching. I don't know how long we sat like that, frozen, trapped by the presence in the doorway. It felt like an eternity, 1,000 years of waiting, of watching, of being watched. And then, without a sound, it was gone. The figure vanished. The door slammed shut with such force that the entire room shook. It was like the very walls themselves had trembled with the finality of its departure. I wanted to scream, to cry, but no sound escaped my lips. I turned to Mark, my face pale, my hands shaking. "Mark, did you see that?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide with disbelief. I reached out, but he flinched away, still unable to process what had just happened. And then, that's when it hit me. This was no longer just a hotel. The hotel wasn't just a building. It wasn't even a place. It was alive. A presence that had been here long before we arrived and would be here long after we were gone. It had claimed us. We were never meant to leave. We were trapped. I closed my eyes, but the image of that figure, that thing, was burned into my mind. I could still feel it, watching us from the darkness. That was the final warning. And there was no escaping. Not now. Not ever. The second night was when the horror really began to set in. It was a strange, suffocating stillness that settled over the room. Mark and I had tried to pretend that the first night was just some weird, freakish dream. We tried to tell ourselves that the shadows we saw weren't alive, that the whispers weren't real, that it was all just our minds playing tricks on us. But as the minutes turned to hours, I could feel it. This place wasn't normal. It wasn't just a hotel, it was something else. I couldn't sleep. The room felt too heavy, too alive. The silence in the air wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. I could feel something pressing in on us, a weight that got heavier with every breath I took. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the bed felt amplified in the quiet. I wanted to scream, to shout at the walls, to demand that whatever was watching us leave us alone. But I didn't. I couldn't. The fear gripped me tighter than anything else. It was as if the hotel itself had wrapped around us, suffocating any chance of escape. Mark was still awake too. I could hear him pacing across the floor, his footsteps slow and hesitant like he was waiting for something. The silence between us was thick, heavy, and we both knew it. The air was colder now, sharp and bitter, biting into my skin. I pulled the covers up to my neck, but it didn't help. Nothing could chase away the fear, not the blankets, not the bed, not even Mark's quiet presence beside me. "Lisa," he whispered, breaking the silence, his voice low and strained. "This place, it's not right." I nodded, not trusting my voice. It wasn't just in our heads. The hotel wasn't just a creepy rundown place. It was something far worse. It was alive. I could feel it in the walls, in the air, pressing on us, watching us, waiting for us to do something, to give it the excuse it needed to pull us deeper into its grasp. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I feel it too. The creaking in the hallway began again. This time, it was louder. Slow, deliberate footsteps, dragging as if someone, or something, was pacing outside our door. My heart jumped in my chest, and I felt Mark freeze beside me. The footsteps were getting closer, too close. There was no one else in the hotel. We had checked. We were the only ones here. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it was just my mind, praying that whatever was happening was just some trick of the darkness. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved closer, closer to our door, and then it happened. The door, it moved. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even scream. The door, which had been tightly shut just moments ago, was now opening, slowly, gently, as if something was pushing it from the other side. I could see the dark hallway outside through the crack that was widening with every passing second. The shadows in the hall were deeper, darker than they should have been. They stretched impossibly long, and for a moment I thought they were alive, reaching for us, pulling us into the darkness. "Mark," I whispered, but my voice was barely more than a breath. "The door, it's opening." Mark didn't say anything at first. He didn't move. He was staring at the door, his face pale with fear. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, anything. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. The door creaked wider, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, each beat growing louder. Something was behind that door. Something that didn't belong in this world. The darkness outside seemed to breathe. The shadows twisted, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something moving in the corner of my eye, but then it was there, standing in the doorway. The figure was tall, too tall, and its form was wrong, distorted. It didn't belong in the world I knew. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and it moved in a way that didn't make sense, like it wasn't walking, but floating, gliding through the air. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and suffocating. I felt it pierce through me, through my very soul. It was staring directly at me. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. All I could do was stare at it as it stood there in the doorway, its presence filling the room, its darkness seeping into the very air. It wasn't just there in the room, it was inside of it, inside of me. Mark finally spoke, his voice strained, panic in every syllable. "Lisa, what is that? What is that thing?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. I could only watch as it stood there, its shape shifting, warping, as though it was too big to fit in this world, too wrong for this place. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were closing in around us. And then, as if it were never there at all, the figure disappeared. It was gone. 1 second, it was standing in front of us, and the next, it was nothing but a shadow in the dark hallway. The door slammed shut behind it, shaking the walls, shaking the very room we were in. I could feel the vibrations run through my body. My heart raced, my head spun. "What? What was that?" Mark gasped, his voice trembling. Did you see that?" I nodded, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't form any words. I was shaking, my body frozen in place. The room felt colder now, too cold. The fear was overwhelming. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Had we imagined it? But I knew the truth now. I knew what the hotel was, what it had been all along. This place was alive. It was feeding on us, on our fear, on our confusion. It had always been here, and it had always been waiting. We were never meant to leave. I turned to Mark, my face pale, my eyes wide with terror. "We can't get out, Mark. We can't leave. It won't let us." He stared at me, his face pale, his body rigid with shock. But even in his eyes I could see it, the realization. The same truth had hit him too. We weren't just trapped in a hotel. We were trapped inside the hotel. And now the hotel had claimed us. We were never going to leave. Not now, not ever. That second night was when I truly realized the horror of our situation. Up until then, I had tried to convince myself that everything was just in my head, something to do with the isolation, the exhaustion, maybe even some bad luck. But after everything that happened, I couldn't deny it anymore. We weren't just staying in some creepy hotel. This place was alive, and it wasn't letting us go. Mark and I had tried to stay calm, tried to convince ourselves that we could just sleep it off, that everything would feel normal in the morning. But the moment the door slammed shut behind us, I felt it. Felt the weight of the hotel bearing down on us. The darkness wrapped around me, suffocating me. The air felt wrong. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Every whisper in the air felt sharp, like it was trying to claw its way into my mind. I looked at Mark, but his face mirrored mine. Pale, wide-eyed, filled with a terror I couldn't deny. We couldn't sleep, not after what happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting for us just beyond the door. I sat up, pulling the covers tightly around my shoulders. I wanted to speak, wanted to say something to him, but the words were stuck in my throat. There was a tightness in the room, a thick, oppressive pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Mark." My voice came out low and trembling. "Do you feel that?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the door, his hands clenched into fists. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "I feel it. Like the walls are watching us." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I wasn't sure what was worse, the silence or the growing sense that we were being hunted by something we couldn't even see. The seconds dragged on like hours. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could feel the chill seeping into my bones. I pulled the blanket tighter, but it didn't help. Nothing would. And then, just as I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, the door creaked. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze me in place. It was a soft, subtle sound, like someone pushing against the door. I turned to Mark, my pulse quickening. He was staring at the door now, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark nodded slowly, his lips trembling. "I hear it." Another creak. The door, which had been firmly shut when we came in, was moving. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the very air around us was holding us here, trapping us in this room, in this nightmare. The door inched open, so slowly, so quietly I could hardly hear it, but I felt it. The cold air from the hallway, the unseen force pushing against the door, pulling it open just enough for something to come through. Mark's hand shot out, grabbing mine, his grip tight, his breath ragged. "No, no, no," he muttered under his breath. "We have to get out." I wanted to run too. I wanted to escape more than anything, but I couldn't move. The air was thick with fear, and no matter how hard I tried, my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The door was wide enough now, wide enough for something to step through. I saw it. It wasn't a person, it wasn't a shadow. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Tall, so tall that its head nearly brushed the top of the doorframe. Its body was wrong. Too thin, too long. Its limbs jerking at unnatural angles as it stood there in the doorway, as if the air itself was rejecting it, struggling to keep it from existing in the space it occupied. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't pull my eyes from it. I didn't even know if it had a face. I couldn't see one. There was only darkness. Empty, endless darkness. But I could feel it. I could feel it looking at me, and I could feel the weight of its gaze as if it was digging into my very soul. Mark squeezed my hand tighter, his fingers shaking. "Lisa," he whispered, "what is that? What the hell is it?" I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. It wasn't alive. Not in any way that made sense. This thing, whatever it was, didn't belong here. And yet, it was here, in our room, watching us. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my chest heavy with fear, and every breath I tried to take felt like I was choking. The thing in the doorway didn't move. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with a kind of cold that froze my very blood. I could feel it crawling under my skin, spreading through my veins like ice. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, it was standing there, in the doorway, watching us. The next, it was nothing. Vanished. As if the very walls had swallowed it whole. I don't know how long we sat there in the dead silence that followed. Time seemed to stretch, like the moment itself had become frozen, suspended in the air. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my mind racing to understand what had just happened. I turned to Mark, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Did you see that?" I asked. My mouth felt dry, my tongue thick. He nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. I saw it, but it wasn't real. It couldn't have been. But it was real. I knew it was. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like distant voices, but they grew louder, closer. They seemed to come from the walls, from the air itself, but there was no escaping them, no way to stop them. The voices filled the room, the air thick with their presence, until I couldn't hear my own thoughts anymore. "You're already here." The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't in the room with us. It was in us, in my mind, in my blood. It was speaking from the very walls of the hotel. And in that moment I understood. We hadn't just walked into this hotel. We hadn't just checked in. No. The hotel had been waiting for us. It had been waiting for me, for us, for as long as it needed to, until it finally claimed us. There was no escape. There never had been. And I realized, with sickening certainty, that we had never been guests. Not really. We were trapped. And the hotel, it was alive. And it was never, ever going to let us go. The hallway outside stretched on forever, like a never-ending corridor into darkness. The door had closed behind us, and we had entered into a place where time had no meaning, where the rules of the world no longer applied. The hotel was watching, waiting, and there was no way out. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.